At approximately 8:30 a.m. on 21st January 2003, inside a converted shed on a rural property in Pipiroa, a small farming settlement on the Hauraki Plains near Thames, 35-year-old Antonie Dixon consumed a mixture of orange juice, cocaine, and methamphetamine. That detail would later appear in criminologist Russell Durrant's academic chapter on drugs and crime. But at that moment, it was simply another event in a long pattern of substance use. By the early hours of 22nd January, security cameras at a shopping centre service station in Highland Park, Pakuranga, would capture 25-year-old James Teaute falling after a burst of gunfire. Only when detectives compared scene diagrams and timestamps did it become clear that the Pipiroa shed and the Pakuranga car park belonged to the same 11-hour case file. On the morning of 24th January 2003, Antonie Dixon was living in a converted shed on a rural property in Pipiroa, sharing the space with his partner, Renee Gunby, while former partner Simon Butler was also staying there. The Court of Appeal judgment would later describe this simply as the place in which Mr. Dixon was living at Pipiroa, an ordinary outbuilding repurposed as accommodation, unremarkable in a region where such arrangements were common on farming properties. According to Durrant's documented account, Dixon consumed the drug cocktail that morning in the house on the property. Butler would later testify in the High Court that Dixon's methamphetamine use had been escalating and that she believed it was affecting his mental state. She told the court he was losing his mind, a phrase preserved in contemporaneous press reports summarizing her evidence. At this point, however, no formal complaint existed. These observations sat in the background, in probation notes, informal comments, family conversations. On paper, Dixon already carried more than 150 convictions and at least 14 prison sentences, predominantly for property offences. But on the morning of 21st January, the Pipiroa shed remained just an address, not yet a crime scene. Within hours, that same location would be logged as the starting point of an 11-hour series of major violent offences. While the activity at Pipiroa went unreported on 21st January, Dixon's history already existed across multiple institutional files. Biographical summaries compiled for court and media reporting noted that he had suffered severe abuse as a child, documented a history of family disruption, and recorded repeated entries into the criminal justice system from a young age. Probation reports and sentencing remarks listed a recognizable pattern: theft, burglary, dishonesty offences, short prison terms, followed by further offending upon release. By 2003, Dixon matched the general profile of high-risk inmates described in research on Auckland Prison at Paramoremo: extensive prior offending, substance abuse, and escalating violence. These contextual facts would become relevant only after the events of January 2003. At the time, they remained in older case files, disconnected from the current Pipiroa address. Butler's later testimony that she had previously asked police to either stop watching Dixon or arrest him because he was losing his mind illustrated that concerns existed in the community. Those concerns, however, had not resulted in preemptive detention or mental health intervention. The records documented a history of risk. They did not document any formal action taken on 21st January 2003 to prevent what would follow. The next entries in his file would not be another set of property charges, but the beginning of the Pipiroa assault sequence. Later on 21st January 2003, events inside the Pipiroa shed escalated from verbal paranoia to physical violence. Court summaries and Durrant's academic chapter align on the sequence. Dixon first attacked Renee Gunby with a hammer, breaking her arm, then used a samurai sword to sever her right hand completely. He subsequently attacked Simone Butler, partially severing both of her arms and inflicting additional wounds, including what medical reports described as an attempted scalping. Butler later testified in the High Court in Auckland, her account preserved in contemporaneous reporting. "I remember my hands going." She told the court that Dixon had accused her of sleeping with the police and being part of a conspiracy against him, statements consistent with earlier reports of his persecutory beliefs and religiously framed delusions. During the attack, according to her testimony, he claimed to be the devil, the devil's son, and one of the chosen 144,000, telling her she had to be sacrificed. No neighbors or other witnesses were recorded as observing the attack itself. The physical evidence was contained within the shed interior: blood on walls and floor, a broken sword blade, a severed hand later transported with Gunby in hopes of surgical reattachment. Medical records subsequently confirmed that Gunby's hand was permanently lost, while Butler's arms were successfully reattached following complex surgical procedures. Once emergency services were notified, the Pipiroa shed was designated as the primary scene in a serious wounding investigation. As local officers secured the property and paramedics transported the women, Dixon was already leaving the area in a stolen vehicle, moving the case from one police district into another. The exact time of the first 111 call from Pipiroa is not published in available records, but media accounts and court materials confirm that emergency services received reports of a sword attack on 21st January 2003. Call takers documented multiple critical details: a location on the Hauraki Plains, 2 injured women, one with at least one hand severed, the offender having fled the scene. Police and ambulance crews were dispatched to the rural address. Upon arrival, first responders triaged Gunby and Butler, stabilizing them for transport. The women were taken to hospital for emergency surgery, with the severed hand placed in a sterile container in an attempt to preserve it for reattachment. Surgical teams would later describe in court testimony the extent of the injuries and the procedures required to reattach Butler's arms. Uniformed officers secured the converted shed and surrounding property, establishing cordons and initiating scene logs. Forensic staff were requested. Standard procedures in a suspected attempted murder investigation followed, photographing the interior, marking and collecting the broken sword, the hammer, blood samples, and other trace evidence. At this stage, Dixon was identified as the suspect, but his direction of travel remained unknown. A description of him and the stolen vehicle was circulated to surrounding districts. The Pipiroa shed was now a sealed crime scene with forensic examination underway. The primary suspect was believed to be mobile and armed. Within hours, a second 111 call, this time from Auckland, would expand the investigation from a single scene to a multi-scene, multi-district operation. After attacking Gunby and Butler, Dixon left Pipiroa in a stolen vehicle and drove north toward Auckland. News coverage and court summaries would later describe the journey as part of an 11-hour methamphetamine-fueled crime spree beginning on the Hauraki Plains and ending in East Auckland. The exact route and any intermediate stops were reconstructed afterward from witness statements, fuel receipts where available, and calculated travel times. What investigators established with certainty was that by the early hours of 22nd January 2003, Dixon had reached the Highland Park and Pakuranga area of East Auckland. Operationally, this period illustrated the difficulty of tracking a moving offender in real time. Patrol cars were tasked to search for the described vehicle. Communication centers updated units as information came in. But the case remained anchored primarily to the Pipiroa scene until the second major incident occurred. On the investigative timeline, this represented a transitional period, neither fully documented in contemporaneous records nor empty of significance. It would be filled in retrospect by matching Dixon's known movements to the attack that followed. The next data point investigators would receive was not a vehicle sighting, but another crime scene. In the early hours of 22 January 2003, at a shopping centre service station car park in Highland Park, Pakuranga, CCTV cameras recorded a sequence that would form a central element of the subsequent homicide file. Contemporary accounts vary on the precise minute, but agree on location and sequence. The footage, later described in news reporting and court proceedings, showed James Teot, aged 25, in the car park area with a co-worker. Dixon arrived in a vehicle. The Crown would later argue at trial that he lured Teot toward his car, then fired a burst from a homemade submachine gun, striking Teot in the back as he attempted to flee. Multiple 111 calls from the service station reported shots fired, a man down, an armed offender leaving the scene. First responders found Teot critically injured. He could not be saved. Forensic officers recovered spent cartridge cases from the car park, later matching them to the homemade firearm seized upon Dixon's arrest. Court reporting documented that Teot was struck by 10 bullets, all entering his back. The CCTV timestamps provided investigators with an anchor time for the shooting, which was then aligned with the Pipiroa events to construct the larger timeline. What had initially been logged as a single car park shooting now sat alongside the earlier Pipiroa assault in a case file involving the same suspect. When police tracked Dixon to a third location where a hostage situation developed, all three scenes would be combined into a single major investigation. After the Pakuranga shooting, Dixon traveled to another address in East Tamaki, where he took a man hostage. Getty images, captions, and news coverage from 22 January 2003 identify Inchinham Road as the location of the final standoff. Police cordoned off the area. The Armed Offenders Squad was deployed alongside specialist negotiators. Photographs taken that day show a line of armed officers. Detective Inspector Steve Rutherford was later photographed briefing media at the scene. Radio logs and internal police reports documented the phases of the standoff: containment, negotiation attempts, ongoing risk assessments regarding Dixon's access to firearms, and his demonstrated willingness to use them. Prosecutors would later note in court that Dixon had spoken about wanting to go out in a blaze of glory, making reference to previous mass shootings in New Zealand, a claim reported contemporaneously in media coverage. After several hours, Dixon released the hostage and surrendered to police without further injury or death. Operationally, the surrender ended the immediate threat. It also gave investigators a suspect who could be interviewed, formally charged, and assessed psychiatrically. With Dixon in custody, attention shifted from real-time crisis management to the methodical work of reconstructing what had occurred at each location and establishing how the scenes connected. Once the scenes were secured and Dixon was in custody, detectives began constructing a detailed timeline of the preceding 11 hours. That figure, 11 hours, derived from police records and court documents bracketing the first attacks at Pipiroa and Dixon's eventual surrender in East Tamaki. Investigators assembled multiple evidence streams: 111 call logs from Pipiroa and Pakuranga with recorded times, hospital admission records and surgical documentation for Gunby and Butler, CCTV timestamps and footage from the Highland Park service station, witness statements from associates, passing motorists, and service station staff, patrol logs and radio transmissions from the East Tamaki standoff. The Pipiroa shed became the fixed origin point on all diagrams, the starting location projected during interviews and later displayed in court. The Highland Park car park and Inchinham Road were plotted as subsequent points against time and distance. Durrant's reference to the 8:30 a.m. drug consumption at Pipiroa helped investigators and analysts fix the beginning of Dixon's altered state on that day. Psychiatric interviews conducted with Dixon, including those by Dr. Carl Janssen, also entered the timeline as he recounted when he first felt compelled to act violently. The assembled timeline was not a reconstruction of motive. It was a structured sequence of documented events against which legal responsibility could be assessed. The next evidentiary layer would address not what happened, but why Dixon claimed he did it, and how that claim would interact with New Zealand's insanity law. As the prosecution file took shape, Dixon's mental state became a central issue in the case. Court records and media sources documented that he advanced an insanity defense, arguing that he had been suffering from a disease of the mind and acting under psychotic delusions at the time of the offences. Psychiatric evidence introduced at trial and referenced in appeal proceedings detailed long-standing mental health issues, severe childhood abuse, and heavy methamphetamine use. Durrant's academic work noted that Dixon later told psychiatrist Carl Janssen that God told him to carry out the attacks, a statement reflected in court reporting, though prosecutors challenged the timing and consistency of this claim. Simone Butler's testimony provided additional context. She told the court that during the attack, Dixon claimed to be the devil, the devil's son, and one of the chosen 144,000, framing his actions within a religious narrative and stating that she had to be sacrificed. She also testified that he believed he was being followed and that she was conspiring with police against him. The legal question for the jury was not whether Dixon had mental health problems. That was broadly accepted by both prosecution and defense. The question was whether he met the statutory test for insanity under New Zealand law, whether he was suffering from a disease of the mind so severe that he did not know his acts were morally wrong. The Court of Appeal would later emphasize that the critical determination was whether Dixon could distinguish right from wrong according to ordinary community standards. The intersection of methamphetamine-associated psychosis and pre-existing psychological disturbance complicated the psychiatric analysis. Ultimately, it would fall to two separate juries to determine whether his condition removed criminal responsibility. In 2005, Dixon stood a trial in the High Court at Auckland for the murder of James Teort, the attempted murder and maiming of Renee Gunby and Simone Butler, kidnapping, firearms charges, and related offences arising from the January 2003 events. Media coverage noted Dixon's appearance in court. His distinctive haircut and wide-eyed expressions drew significant public attention throughout the proceedings. His legal team advanced an insanity defense, while the Crown characterized him as a violent man with a serious methamphetamine habit who was claiming mental illness to avoid imprisonment. The evidence presented to the jury included detailed medical testimony from surgeons who had treated Gunby and Butler, describing severed limbs and reattachment procedures in clinical terms, forensic reconstructions of the Pipiroa shed, the Highland Park car park, and the East Tamaki hostage location, ballistic evidence linking recovered shell casings to the homemade submachine gun, and psychiatric reports from both defense and Crown experts, covering diagnoses, drug use, and prior incidents. After deliberations, the jury found Dixon guilty of murder and the other charges. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum non-parole period reported in later summaries as approximately 20 years. At that point, on the public record, the case appeared resolved. Conviction, sentence, trial concluded. The subsequent appeal, however, would demonstrate that procedural correctness and factual conclusions do not always align on the first attempt. In 2007, the Court of Appeal of New Zealand quashed Dixon's convictions and ordered a retrial. The appellate court's concern was not that the evidence was insufficient to support conviction. Rather, the judges found that the jury directions on insanity and diminished responsibility had been overly complex and potentially confusing. The judgment criticized how the trial judge had framed the jury's task, indicating that jurors should have been asked more simply whether, on the balance of probabilities, Dixon's disease of the mind meant he did not know his acts were morally wrong at the time. This was a procedural matter. The court sought to ensure that the legal test for insanity and the applicable burden of proof were correctly explained to the jury. A second trial was held in the High Court at Auckland in 2008. The evidence presented was broadly similar: the attacks at the Pipiroa shed, the shooting at the Pakuranga car park, the hostage situation, and the psychiatric assessments. The defense again argued insanity. The Crown again argued that Dixon's crimes were intentional and calculated. The second jury returned the same essential verdicts. Dixon was convicted of murdering James Teote, maiming Gunby and Butler, kidnapping, and the firearms offences. By reconvicting him, the second jury accepted that, despite his documented mental health issues and intoxication, Dixon knew his acts were wrong in the manner the law required. Before sentencing could proceed on the reconvicted charges, the case file would gain one final unexpected entry. On 4th February 2009, while awaiting sentencing following his reconviction, Antonie Dixon was found dead in his cell at Auckland Prison, Paramoremo. News reports described his death as an apparent suicide. The specific mechanism was detailed in the subsequent coroner's investigation rather than in general media coverage. The High Court formally noted his death, bringing the pending sentencing process to an end. Justice Hugh Williams explained to media that documents provided to the court confirmed only Dixon's death, not its cause. That determination was left to the coroner. In September 2012, at an inquest held in the Auckland District Court, Detective Sergeant Scott Armstrong read from an ESR toxicology report stating that methamphetamine had been detected in Dixon's blood and urine at the time of his death. This finding confirmed that even within a maximum security facility, he had obtained and consumed the same substance that had featured so prominently in his offending. The inquest examined questions of drug access within prison and adequacy of inmate monitoring. Dixon's death ended the legal proceedings, but left unresolved questions about methamphetamine circulation in correctional facilities. The human impact was reflected in media interviews with Margaret and David Roberts, James Teote's aunt and uncle, who spoke publicly about their nephew's death in the Pakuranga car park and the prolonged legal process that followed. Their comments remain part of the public record. In the final analysis, the case anchors to 3 physical locations: the converted shed at Pipiroa, where Rene Gunby and Simone Butler were attacked with a samurai sword on 21 January 2003, resulting in the severing and permanent maiming of their limbs; the Highland Park Service Station car park in Pakuranga, where James Teote was shot dead with a homemade submachine gun in the early hours of 20 January 2003, captured on security cameras as he tried to run; the Inchinham Road address in East Tamaki, where Dixon held a hostage before surrendering to armed police, ending an 11-hour spree that had begun on the Hauraki Plains and ended in suburban Auckland; the Pipiroa shed, once an ordinary living space on a rural property, became an exhibit in 2 High Court trials. Its layout was described in judgments and reconstructed for juries. The Pakuranga car park, initially an unremarkable commercial forecourt, became the location family members referenced when speaking to media about that Tuesday night. Legally, the case resolved with Dixon's reconviction, his death in custody, and an inquest confirming methamphetamine in his system at the time of death. Psychiatrically, it remains cited in discussions of methamphetamine-associated psychosis and criminal responsibility in New Zealand courts. The security camera footage from Highland Park, time-stamped in the early hours of 22nd of January 2003, captured a routine commercial scene: vehicles, fluorescent lighting, figures moving across pavement, until, seconds later, it documented something else entirely. That time stamp, unremarkable when recorded, would anchor the entire case file.